Welcome, everyone, to the Mapped Out Podcast. I am your host, Michael Patterson, along with my co-host, Michael Szymanski. Let's get this episode started, baby. Okay, welcome, everyone, to the podcast. Today's episode is on HIIT training and some of the pros, some of the cons, what it really is and what it really isn't. But before we begin, guys, if you've listened to our show before, you know what we got to ask. Please share the show, share it with like-minded individuals. We've had really good support lately, and we greatly appreciate it. So let's keep up the good work. And the beginning question that everyone is waiting for. Michael, how are you today?
I'm flamboyant.
Okay. Interesting. New. Okay.
First thing that came to my mind.
I love it. I love the energy.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. You know what you do with all that energy? Put it into a HIIT workout.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh, man. We crack ourselves up.
Yeah, I try.
So let's begin, shall we, with what does HIIT even stand for? Is HIIT.
Yeah. It's a high intensity interval training.
Okay. So now that we outlined what it is, guys, that's this episode. We'll see you later. Okay. So what's the definition, I should say, of high intensity interval training, and what does it require in order to be a HIIT workout?
Mm-hmm. So we're working in intervals. So that means usually I read it was anywhere from 60 seconds to 5 minutes. And obviously with those time frames, you'll change the intensity range because you're not going to do the same intensity for 5 minutes versus 60 seconds. Obviously,
Yep,
working in intervals. Logically, that makes sense. But it's different from continuous training, continuous submaximal training, where you're keeping a standard heart rate for a certain amount of time. You elevate to that heart rate, and then you drop down to a lower heart rate once you're done. But this will be elevating to a certain heart rate, or as we'll talk about, a certain VO2 max percentage within some intervals, and then dropping off for a break, and then re-entering that interval, and then dropping off again.
Okay, and then as far as the heart rate difference between a submaximal, we're going to say heart rate for right now, but VO2 max, I guess, would be the same as well. How does that compare heart rate-wise between submaximal and HIIT workouts?
So I believe I read it as HIIT workouts are more in the super maximal or over the threshold
Okay.
of what we would consider being the heart rate or VO2 max within a competition or a regular running workout.
Okay.
Or a continuous steady state cardio workout, for instance. Which makes sense because it's super maximal because you aren't using that pace in your distance run because that would just be probably impossible to do.
Yeah, above the limit, basically.
Versus continuous is just submaximal. So we're working at, a pace that isn't our max, but we're working under it so that we can improve our max.
And we're also talking about, once again, kind of in the name, intervals, right? So you have that expected end time that is at a maximum 5 minutes, which the submaximal or normal running would be for longer durations of time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Okay, so now that we've outlined kind of what it is, what isn't it? Because what does it take to really get to that maximal, super maximal level? Because that's oftentimes a myth that happens, especially on social media, where people say, oh, this is a HIIT training or this is a HIIT workout when it's really not. And how do you tell, okay, this is improving my VO2 max or this is contributing to my progression rather than maybe I'm just wrong in where it should be placed within the workout?
Mm-hmm. So I believe a number that we would agree on is that the submaximal training, continuous training workouts, such as long distance running, Usually fall into a VO2 max range of 50 to 70%.
Okay.
And then high intensity interval training would fall above 70% and usually around 80% of VO2 max. I believe that's what we probably would agree on.
Okay.
And obviously in these types of workouts that you see publicized, we're not tracking VO2 max, and it's hard to know logically and just by observation what the VO2 max is at that current state in the workout.
Sure.
So from that, it's like a fallacy because most people just don't know that certain aspect that this high interval training was used for competitive athletes who, in their case, increasing training volume didn't account for increasing VO2 max. So these were very high-level people. But when introducing high-intensity interval training where we're working at a higher VO2 max, pushing the threshold, we see an increase in their VO2 max over time, which was previously not accounted for by doing continuous training, such as long distance or accounting for more mileage.
Sure.
So this is how it came into being.
Now, before we continue down this road, because I know a big term that most people do not understand is VO2 max.
Yeah.
So let's define that term in the simplest way possible, please.
I would say so. Your lungs can uptake oxygen as a vital nutrient, even though it's not. Yeah, I guess
We'll call it
an energy carrier substrate used in biological processes for generating energy substrates to use for metabolic processes.
Okay.
So the VO2 max is basically like the maximal saturation of the transport processes, aka the turnstile is backed up. So that's the more oxygen you can pack in at that turnstile, the higher your VO2 max. This is why people like is it Vince Armstrong? What's his name?
Neil.
No,
that's the moon.
No, the biker.
Lance
Armstrong.
Lance
sorry.
Armstrong.
obviously I'm a biker aficionado.
Oh, of course.
But I believe he had a genetic predisposition for having a higher VO2 max.
Sure.
So that's why he could crank out and beat a lot more people, especially when he was younger.
And that also leads to higher longevity and improved performance compared to those who would maybe have a low VO2 max.
Yeah, because you're not stressing the system as much.
Yeah, completely. Awesome.
So, yeah, that's kind of a complex way of saying it. But basically it's like the ceiling.
Sure.
The ceiling on a curve of how saturated you can get before you tap out.
And so we were looking at a study, right, where it and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it looked at people who were already endurance athletes and people who weren't. And for the people who weren't, longer durations of endurance activities help improve their VO2 max up to a certain threshold, obviously. But really the HIIT workout was really designed for those athletes that were already maximizing what endurance workouts were doing for their VO2 max, and they needed to get to that next level. And to do that, they needed this expanding threshold workout in small intervals known as HIIT to improve that performance, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and exactly. And that's the difference between their continuous training, continuous steady state training, which is like 50 to 70% VO2 maximum, and then these high interval training where it's the 80% above usually. And this is where they're working in super maximal conditions. So they're pumping out, for instance, if they are running, they're changing their mileage from like a 5-minute mile to like, okay, I'm going to run at like a 3:30 pace or like a 3-minute pace. But that, obviously I'm not going to do that in a mile, but I'm working at a super maximal based off the percentage of my maximum. So they're working at a super maximal rate and then also working at a very higher VO2 max relative to a continuous steady state program. And then, yes, they increased their VO2 max. And that was relative to them adding more volume in a continuous fashion, continuous steady state fashion. And they found that the more volume didn't change the VO2 max, but the interval training did change their VO2 max.
Sure. And so now we've talked a little bit about being an athlete who is already pretty heavy on the performance side. For those who aren't, and those who log on to Instagram and see their favorite influencer with a HIIT workout, how should HIIT workouts be influenced into, or should say not influenced, how should HIIT workouts be added to their workouts, or if they should? What are your opinions on that?
Obviously, I think this should be something that is eased into, purposely because of the metabolic damage that it will cause to people who are not accumulated to the stress.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, meaning that it's hard. So, maybe like throw it in like as like a spice once a week, or like on a Saturday, or like Saturday would be great because you're out Friday, and you're like, oh man, I feel bad. You're gonna like this.
Okay.
So like I got a bad night of sleep because I was out drinking, Friday. Okay, I'll come back.
But you're over the age of 21.
Yeah, sure. And so you get bad sleep. Okay, what happens when we have bad sleep? Well, we are more prone to storing fat, and we don't metabolize carbohydrates or fat as well in our bodies.
Okay.
So one study looked at how high-intensity training, when implemented after a bad night of sleep, will actually help in oxidizing or breaking down fats better, even after a bad night of sleep. So incorporate it after a bad night of sleep, or just after
Hard drinking
a
night.
highly caloric night.
I like it.
But I just thought that was very interesting because you would think counter to that,
Yeah.
because you're already in a crappy state, and
And then-
then you jack your system again. You thought you'd be even worse, but it's actually the counter that's the opposite.
So by pushing your limit after already having a crappy night, you actually get improved results.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
And it's there's a couple of mechanisms. Obviously, I explained the upregulation of enzymes that oxidatively break down these carbohydrates and fats. But another thing is that there's an activation of the sirtuin genes that you're probably familiar with, like sauna and cold therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Sirtuin genes have been linked to longevity, and basically the sirtuin one is activated during this high intensity interval training, and this will activate other processes that are involved with repairing the system. So that's probably another mechanism at work behind the curtain. But obviously, preface to all of this is that we need to know what HIIT actually is, and what processes actually qualify as HIIT.
Yeah.
So I think that would be important to talk about, because there's a lot of socially accepted terms or processes of HIIT, such as like weight training, or like
Exactly.
or like rowing, or like, I don't know, like jogging in place, waving your arms. I don't know. There's a lot of things out there that are like, oh, this is a HIIT workout, but it's
and I think that
gotta be
there's
careful.
exactly. I think there's a myth, not necessarily. I don't think it's with ill will. And I think it's more focused around what's the difference between a lot of different terms like cardio, CrossFit, because I think
cross training, hybrid.
Okay, now we're just naming hybrid athlete.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times those get mixed up, and the next thing you know, you see on an advertisement that it says HIIT workout included with CrossFit, or I think that's what it's most notably attributed with. So what qualifies as, let's talk about it. What qualifies as a HIIT workout exercise-wise?
Mm-hmm. I would say primarily, I think it would make most sense that it's a workout that involves some sort of cardio aspect.
Okay.
Primarily aerobic, I'm guessing, because that would make most sense for improving a VO2 max, because you're working off something that can readily give you a VO2 max reading, whether you get that or not. I think you can work off a mile time. I think that would be mile time or row time, some standardized test, and then work up percentage off of that, but then push towards the higher end of that percentage for a VO2 max. I think that would make sense for a high intensity interval training. But obviously, if you're not a distance person, a runner, then what would make sense to me at least what I've been doing is circuit training. So you're incorporating a higher percentage of a mile time or a sprint time into a circuit weight training thing. So like doing push-ups curls, squats, and then doing like a sprint like
So-
that.
So I think what you're doing is a circuit workout that's using typical anabolic movements. Would you say that?
anaerobic.
Anaerobic, sorry.
Yeah.
Anaerobic movements in a way that is constantly pushing the threshold. If that makes sense.
You're
Without breaks.
you're like you're putting fire onto the primary movement, which is for the VO2 max,
Sure.
which is the running,
Yes.
not the weight training. Because the weight training is more so working on, it's an anaerobic mechanism, so it's more so working on, lactic acid, not lactate, really, but we'll just say lactic acid because everyone knows what that is. So like lactic acid storage and utilization and muscle endurance and stuff like that. But for VO2 max, we're focusing on the lung system. So obviously the running is the primary force for that. But I like to mix it up and make it fun because, I don't know, I'm not a runner, but it's still important. So that, I think, is a HIIT workout, encompassing most of those things. For someone who isn't in a lab with a tube hooked up to their mouth measuring VO2.
You don't do that?
No, I don't.
Oh, man.
Surprisingly not. I haven't gotten the funding for that. So no.
I will say this: you'll be the one person that I would see in there with like 3 tubes hanging out of his mouth, gives me the thumbs up. I got this. Oh man.
Got my altitude mask, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh no, that's different time. Different time. No.
Maybe that can be next week's episode.
But yeah, like for like a general person, that would, I think, working in a high percentage, close to maximum threshold of what your cap is on a time for a certain movement, whether that's rowing, running, swimming, that will definitely be a HIIT workout. But you have to work within an interval. So
Exactly.
you're doing it either with a distance goal interval, which is what I do. It's like a 200 meter, 400 meter, or a time interval. It's like 60 seconds and then like 2 minutes off, or how much time you need.
Now, with the time, are you looking at a certain pace within that period of time?
Yes.
So for rowing, right? Are
yeah.
you doing I'm gonna name a name out of like
30
meters per second or something pace that's a minimum pace for that period of time?
Yeah. So I'm working off my maximum time, or my best time.
Okay.
And then I'm working at a percentage that I couldn't keep up for that distance that the time was recorded in, such as a mile. I'm working at a time that I would never get, so it's super maximal. But then I'm working in an interval
For
that
only a
also
short period of time.
Yeah, for a short period of time.
Gotcha.
So that's another way to say it.
And then you're doing that and then
A couple intervals.
Yeah,
But not killing yourself.
well, that's the thing too. You can't do this for 10 intervals. Absolutely destroyed where you can't get off the rowing machine.
And if you're doing it for that long, you have to question whether you're working in the correct range too.
Exactly. Because this is a
They should be hard.
Yeah,
Each one should be
threshold.
hard. So
Sure.
because you're supposed to be super maximal, so it shouldn't be easily adaptive.
Sure. Okay, so is there any other particular points of the HIIT workouts that we need to understand?
No.
Okay.
I just have like cool stuff about them.
Well, okay, let's hear the cool stuff.
Yeah.
This is where we get the personality.
So obviously the first one being reducing blood pressure.
Okay.
So resting heart rate goes down. So that's kind of cool, and that's in obese and healthy individuals. So it's not just for people who are at health.
I think it's
risk.
also interesting that this is to your personal level. So HIIT workouts, or even just frankly cardio, is at that individual's level, where no matter what fitness background you have, you max out one time just to see where you're at, and then from then on, there's always continuous improvement based off of where you were rather than somebody else. And so it's always on your own, ability and your own skill.
And then there's also decreases in plasma concentrations of cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. And obviously, if I could theorize, a hypothesis is that it's because of how I talked about the increased oxidation of these fats for utilization of energy during these, exercises and HIIT. And also it increases resting energy expenditure. So when you're done, your energy expenditure just resting is also increased. So you're burning calories after exercise.
Yeah, even you get that 2-for-1 special even
Yeah.
after.
Yeah. And then it also improves not only aerobic performance, which we always talk about, but also anaerobic performance.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually is, in that way, you could conclude if you're doing adequate strength stimuli, then it's not muscle wasting.
And you should see small improvements,
Mhm.
but improvements in weightlifting activities.
And then obviously with an increased VO2 max, you see increased area counts of capillary beds and in muscle cells, and so that's obviously beneficial for weight training too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Awesome.
just some cool stuff.
Awesome. So can you give us an outline of just everything that we kind of talked about a little bit, or just some overviews?
Yeah, sure. So HIIT is high intensity interval training. It's performed within intervals that can last from 60 seconds to 5 minutes. However, your intensity will range based on that interval that you choose. You are preferably working in a supermaximal state, which is above your tested baseline for a certain distance. And you're working at a VO2 max around 80% or above. And this is useful in settings where you're using weights, maybe in a circuit style training. And it will increase utilization of energy substrates, and it may help in afterwards, after nights of bad sleep and excess caloric intake. And it'll decrease
decrease
your blood pressure, increase utilization of cholesterol and LDL and triglycerides, and it will probably help increase muscle mass since it's not muscle wasting, increasing aerobic and anaerobic capacities, and increasing capillary bed density. So all these things to say that, you know what, maybe throw it in once a week, and then increase the volume of these training sessions once you get accustomed to the training.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Michael, for that wrap up. If I were you, I'd probably go back.
You said, hey, you said, give me everything we said. I was like, oh, and in my head, I was like, oh boy.
Well, no, and then you could probably hear the music that came on a little bit, and I just saw your face just go, oh, I gotta hurry this up. Okay. Well, guys, that is the show. We appreciate all the support that you guys give us, and hopefully you guys took something away from this. Once again, have a good one, guys.